Hi, this is Paul. I want to keep looking at this Elon Musk conversation with the BBC. I did a video about it last week on beasts and swarms. Twitter is sort of a swarm, but Elon, in a sense, is organizing the arena for the swarm. And what I'm trying to get at are all of these extended bodies and how they function in our culture with respect to the principalities and powers that are among us. Now, Musk bought Twitter towards the end of last year, and when he made a bid for it, there was quite a bit of hoopla in terms of people weighing in on whether this was a good thing or bad thing. Senator Elizabeth Warren's comments were some of the most famous. This deal is dangerous for our democracy. Billionaires like Elon Musk play by a different set of rules than everyone else. Yes. It's like, yeah, well, I'm not, yeah, so do senators. Accumulating power for their own gain. We need a wealth tax and strong rules to hold big tech accountable. Okay, so basically, using this for her own political points. As a result of the sale, Twitter will now be a privately owned company, which is an interesting thing. The difference between a privately owned company and a publicly owned company. To what degree is that? And then as we listen to a bunch of what Musk said, there'll be a lot of nuance in terms of why he bought it, what he desires for it, and in a sense, the degree of altruism. The more you listen to it, it doesn't sound like Musk was accumulating power for his own gain in this, but I think, to me, people are all over the place with respect to Elon Musk. I also want to say again that the purpose of this video is not to have Musk bad or Musk good or BBC bad or BBC good. You're all going to have your own opinions on that, and you're absolutely entitled to them. But to try to get at these spiritual bodies that we have in our world that are holding sway over the body politic and all of our various ecclesiastical and all sorts of other bodies that are in play. Musk, who has said that he would buy Twitter in order to restore the platform's adherence to free speech, and we're going to get into that free speech principles. Free speech is the bedrock of a functioning democracy, and Twitter is the digital town square where matters vital to the future of humanity are debated. Okay, one can very much ask a question whether Twitter is actually a good debate format or a good debate forum. But again, we're going to look at sort of the Arenic powers inherent in this and agents within sort of the arena of the swarm, let's say. I also want to make Twitter better than ever by enhancing products with new features, making the algorithms open source to increase trust. I think there's something to that. People with knowledge might be able to look at that code and make up, find things in it or not find things in it, but most of us wouldn't be able to do anything with it. Defeating spam bots and authenticating all humans. Twitter has tremendous potential. I look forward to working with the company and the community of users to unlock it. Now, in order to facilitate going through these, I made little clips so I wouldn't have to go through the whole thing of just some of the salient parts. But let's begin with this. Let's begin with this once I have my computer set up properly. This is the first clip right at the beginning of the interview.
Why did you agree to do this interview with the BBC?
I don't know. I like spontaneity, and I don't know. There's a lot going on, and it seems like I actually do have a lot of respect for the BBC. Although sometimes I forget what the BBC stands for, But
so he's asked why did he agree to do it, and Musk comes off playfully, and this comes on the heels of Musk. Now we're going to talk about sort of the arena for the swarm, and as you have with YouTube and many of these other things, the arena is trying to shape the agent. Now, when we talk about the metadivine realm with respect to Ezekiel Kaufman and his ideas about the Old Testament, you have the arena, and the agents within the arena, and the arena has laws and rules which shape how the agents respond to one another and, in fact, even respond to the arena.
Do this interview with the BBC?
I don't know. I like spontaneity, and I don't know. There's a lot going on, and it seems like I actually do have a lot of respect for the BBC. Although sometimes I forget what the BBC stands for, you know. But what is it? Just kidding.
You know what it stands for.
Yes, I do.
Now I think this interview was done both on Twitter Live, and a lot of the copies of it on YouTube are from people just capturing the Twitter Live and the BBC. I wondered when I first got this, can I find the whole thing? But yeah, I did find it.
So there's a lot going on. So I thought this might be a good opportunity to answer some questions, and I guess maybe get some feedback too.
Now, feedback is something that he comments on fairly regularly during this whole interview, and he seems quite serious about it. And I think he's a good businessman, and he knows that. A little bit later, he's going to talk about, I don't know if I've included that in the clips that I took. He talks about wanting the user experience to be, wanting the users to be happy, wanting them to be satisfied. So it's very much sort of a customer service, consumer mindset that he's getting at. Again, part of what I wish he had thought about in this interview was more the kinds of things that I'm displaying in terms of the beast versus the swarm.
What should we be doing different? I know the BBC, for example, is not thrilled about being labelled state-affiliated media.
Not exactly. I was going to get to that later, but let's go for it now.
Now, of course, state-affiliated media sounds like Pravda, and there's obviously an inside joke in there.
Actually objected to that term. Do you want to respond to it?
Yeah. So our goal is simply to have, to be as truthful and accurate as possible. So I think.
Okay, truthful and accurate as possible. And that's going to be something that sort of haunts this whole, because truthful and accurate according to what? Now, state-sponsored and publicly supported, that's going to be sort of the swap that they make. Now, both are true. One has a nuance that the other doesn't have. And so this is where this gets difficult in a political sense.
Because I think we're adjusting the label to be publicly funded, which I think is perhaps not too objectionable. We're trying to be accurate.
I'm not the BBC, but
and okay, so we're trying to be accurate. And accurate, we tend to think of accuracy again as sort of correspondence. Now, and he says, I'm not the BBC. Well, right there, okay, so you're a ways down in the hierarchy of the BBC, but there is a hierarchy in the BBC, and in a sense, Elon is at the top of the hierarchy of the swarm container. Let's find language that works like that.
Publicly funded is how the BBC describes it.
Okay, so that would be accurate.
Itself.
If we use the same words that the BBC uses to describe itself, that presumably would be okay. I'm not asking you for a yes or no, since you're not running the BBC per se. But it seems to pass a reasonable.
Okay, now right away here, if we look at, let's say, Elizabeth Warren's comment, accumulating power for their own gain, you look at the agent-arena relationship. So in some ways, Elon Musk is going to be he's going to be manipulating the arena. Let's think about it that way. The container in which the swarm lives. And now this arena obviously is within a much larger arena, let's say the public discourse or the public world. And so in that way, Twitter is sort of a containerized swarm. And what's interesting is that now the BBC, likewise, has power, and they're going to get into the relative power of these two entities as, again, they go into it a little bit more.
So you're going to change those labels on the BBC Twitter feed and also NPRs as well?
Yeah.
Right.
Publicly funded. Basically, that's we're trying to be as accurate as possible.
Okay.
But in rough numbers, revenue dropped from 4.5 billion to 3, and expenses went from 4.5 to 6, creating a $3 billion negative cash flow situation.
Okay, now Elon's going to get tagged here on the question of care, which is interesting because, again, we're looking at the container of the swarm, and there's an expectation, or at least a duty, on behalf, expressed on behalf of the people who were fired. I imagine he's being an ally to the people who were fired. And now Elon is basically stating the business case that this container actually has to have a life of its own in order to sustain the employees that sort of make up the container.
And Twitter having $1 billion in the bank. That's 4 months to live. So unless drastic action was taken immediately, this company's going to die and be owned by banks.
Let's talk about that drastic action, because almost immediately you sacked a lot of Twitter workers. And I spoke to them. It was very easy to speak to them when it happened.
Of course it was easy to speak to them. They were all unemployed.
And the way they said, pretty much everyone said, is that it felt quite haphazard.
It was.
And it felt a little bit uncaring.
Haphazard, he says he agrees with that. And uncaring. Now, this is interesting because, again, the quality of this container, this container is supposed to have an agency of its own, and that agency is supposed to include caring. Now, what's the relationship between that agency and Musk? Now, again and again, he'll say, well, you're the CEO of Twitter. No, I'm not. My dog is. And that's kind of a little inside joke. But so now you have care, which is, well, we're looking at the agentic quality of the arena.
I wouldn't say uncaring. The issue is like the company's either going to go bankrupt, or if we do not cut costs immediately, this is not a caring, uncaring situation. It's like if the whole ship sinks, then nobody's got a job.
Right.
Yeah.
But a lot of people just lost their jobs like that. And they weren't. They didn't even know they'd lost their jobs often. They just were just
so let me
frozen out
ask
of
you,
their accounts.
what would you do?
Well, you might want to give someone some notice. I mean, you might. By the way, I'm not running Twitter, but
I know, but
this is the criticism, and this is what staff members say. A little bit of notice,
No, I understand. You have 4 months to live. 120 days. In 120 days, you're dead.
Now we're putting it into personal terms here. So you have 4 months to live. So before it was sort of a boat metaphor, and now we have a life metaphor.
So what do you want to do?
How much are you worth?
And notice how, well, you're going to put it on him. And, okay, well, you're a rich man. You should pay your own pocket. So now we have all these different ideas about pockets.
I don't know.
But we're talking about around the $200 billion mark. I mean, it's not quite. You're framing it in a way that it had a few months to live. You're quite a rich man.
I sold a lot of Tesla stock to close this deal. I did not want to sell the Tesla stock.
Okay. Do you have any regrets on the way that some of the staff were let go?
Okay, now he's going to talk more about the Tesla stock, and the idea is now in some ways. So don't expect, Tesla is bailing out Twitter. So now we have these two entities out there in this world, these two corporations, these two corporate bodies, and they're going to go back to this. And this regret question, twill silly wabbit, this regret question continues to come up again and again.
I mean, people were given 3 months of severance, some cases more. So, but we're like I said, the companies need to run on their own cognizance, and it's not so easy for me to sell stock as you might think. I have to sell stock during certain periods. I can't sell stock during other periods. So there are only brief windows where I can sell Tesla stock, And then this is often taken as some lack of faith in Tesla. And in fact, the Tesla stock sales caused the Tesla stock to plummet, which is not good.
Do you think those two were connected?
Well, the people couldn't parse the difference between I'm selling Tesla stock because I've lost faith in Tesla, which I haven't, or that it's desperately needed for Twitter.
This is a remarkably bad interview, and Musk in some ways sort of wants to have it in a conversational style, and this guy keeps looking at his phone and pulling these questions off, and he can't keep track of the questions that he asks.
Okay, and then after that, after you let go of a lot of stuff, obviously Twitter became slimmed down a lot, and then you started making some more policy decisions. One of those policy decisions was to bring Donald Trump back. He hasn't actually tweeted yet.
Right.
Okay, now policy. Okay, so that's this is sort of the agentic quality of the arena, because policies, these are the rules that govern the swarm, and we're looking at this within the larger politic, and now we have Donald Trump, and we're going to bring Donald Trump into the conversation.
Do you expect him to come back at any point? Like, have you spoken to him?
I haven't spoken to him. I don't know. He may or may not come back. But the point is that Twitter should be a town square that is gives equal voice to the whole country and ideally the whole world. It should not be a partisan politics. And the more of a partisan politics that are on the very far left of the spectrum. San Francisco, Berkeley politics normally is quite niche. But if Twitter effectively acted as a megaphone for very niche regional politics and megaphone that to the world.
Okay, so now we have the question about we're going to manage the swarm by sort of regulating the rules and, say Berkeley, San Francisco politics is impacting the overall body politic because of the way it's using the swarm. So by allowing Donald Trump back in, you're going to, and of course, who knows, I think in a lot of ways, Trump just sort of poked the bear with a lot of his stuff on Twitter. That's just tends to be a lot of what Donald Trump does.
So if in order for something to serve as a digital town square, it must serve all people from all political persuasions, provided it's legal. So
now the legal thing comes in quite a bit in the interview, and he's going to talk about restrictions of speech in different legal entities. They'll get into India in a little bit, but I clipped that one out. So they're going to be weighing this stuff.
Close to half the country voted for Trump. I wasn't one of them. I voted for Biden. But nonetheless, free speech is meaningless unless you allow people you don't like to say things you don't like. Otherwise, it's irrelevant. And if at the point at which you lose free speech, it doesn't come back.
I think the issue some people have is that a lot of people were brought back. I mean, some people were brought back who were previously banned for spreading.
Okay, so he basically said the way the swarm works is you just have to let it swarm. You have to let the people do what they think, do what they want within this platform, within this container, and that basically then it functions. And that way, Twitter, the swarm can function sort of on the whole.
Things like QAnon conspiracies. You have people like Andrew Tate who were brought back, who were previously banned for things like hate speech. Do you think you prioritize freedom of speech over misinformation and hate speech?
Okay, and this is the part that, of course, got everybody's attention, because the idea is, okay, so you've got this swarm that's an agent in the larger arena, and if you let hate speech into the swarm, then that will then, of course, impact the larger arena, and Musk is going to challenge him on, okay, talk to me about this hate speech. And they actually never get anywhere with respect to this conversation.
Well, who's to say that something is misinformation? Who's the arbiter of that? Is it the BBC?
You're literally asking me?
Yes.
Well, no, you are the arbiter on Twitter because you own Twitter.
Yes, I'm saying.
Okay, so now, oh, you're the arbiter on Twitter. Okay, so suddenly the arena has a function, has an agentic function within itself and within the larger arena of the body politic. And Musk says basically, who's supposed to decide? And the whole concept of the swarm is that within the swarm, things are sort of going to be able to be worked out. Now, I want to jump into the Megan Phelps-Roper conversation at Oxford Union because Twitter actually plays a pretty important part in this. She makes the point that Twitter was central to, now the language here is interesting, disenchantment. So in other words, the spell she was under when she was there with her family was an enchantment. That's enchantment as a negative thing. The spell she was under was an enchantment, and then Twitter was important for her disenchantment.
Really important. I started to say some of this. There were a lot of things about Twitter that helped me see outside of Westboro's ideology. And it started first, I think, with a change in how I communicated with people. So first, the fact that there were only 140 characters at the time. There wasn't space for the kind of insults that we used. Just always, my mom, every time she mentioned George W. Bush, she would call him bombastic, blowhard, big mouth, bimbo, bastard, like every time. Like, and those they did that like all the time. That was just the way that they communicated. It goes back to that, like, well, if God can get the message across no matter how you talk to people. And so that was part of it. So I stopped using those kind of insults, first because there wasn't space, and second because I realized that it almost immediately cut the conversation off from being about this profound theological point that I thought was so important.
Okay, now that's really interesting because she obviously had grown up within a frame within a different container that had allowed for longer theological discourse. This was the kind of thing that she was looking for. This was the kind of arena in which she was imagining her and her ideas and her family's ideas would have been victorious, and the rules within Twitter prohibited that from actually happening.
To being this kind of playground quarrel, and so I stopped that. It showed me sides of people that I never saw IRL, right, in real life. Whenever I was in physical space with other people, even though I went to public school, like I never felt safe. And having this like physical distance, this buffer.
Now this is really interesting too. She never felt safe. She felt like all this language about safe spaces. Public school was a dangerous space, and you get that from the background of her family. They were very much on a war against this other larger realm, and so being in school, but now suddenly with the internet, she was sort of separated from everything, and now Twitter both on one hand made her feel safer than when she was at school.
Between me and these other people, it made me open in a way that I never could be, in person with other people. When it almost like I've been talking recently about this. I was talking to an anthropologist who said she defined shame as being the feeling that we get when we know we have violated the norms of our community. So for most of my life, I had grown up in this culture that celebrated death and tragedy. And then I got on Twitter, and over time, because I started making these real connections with other people, they started to become an alternate form of community for me. The first other form of community that I'd ever experienced. And when I was seeing their reactions when, mass shootings or, the death of a celebrity or some well-beloved person, over time, that I started to, in other words, I felt kind of like I could feel the empathy that I would naturally have felt outside of a group like Westboro. So it kind of enabled me to actually feel this. And then eventually that was what, I never felt shame for what we did at Westboro until I got on Twitter.
Now, this is very interesting because, so let's look at the beast. She would have, let's say for the New York Times or the BBC or any of these beasts that she would associate with beasts, they wouldn't communicate for her give her sort of an Arenic relationship, an agent-arena relationship, where she could mind read and feel what others would. And the swarm afforded that for her.
After I'd been on Twitter for a while and had been in conversation with outsiders in a way that let me see their humanity.
And how did that develop into actually leaving permanently?
So eventually it came to that moment, painting in the basement. Like, it was just this kind of pile of mounting doubts, and there came this moment where, trying to resolve the contradiction between, all of these things, like, so these theological points, and then the way that church members were treating one another, the way that they were, lying about, protests, like photoshopping themselves into pickets that they had not actually, participated in, and trying to deceive people. So how do you, resolve this contradiction between these points, these doctrines and practices that, to my mind, were so clearly unscriptural, and then this belief in the infallibility of the Bible and in Westborough's interpretation of it? One of those had to give, and in that moment, it was the latter.
This is just such a classic story of a worldview shift, where there's dissonance, it's arising. What's really interesting is that the flip of her worldview will still be based on all of the foundational rules that she picked up in the religious community.
Who is to say that one person's misinformation is another person's information? The point at which you said that there is this is misinformation. Like, who is going to decide that?
You accept that misinformation can be dangerous, that it can cause real-world harms, that it can potentially cause.
Yes.
And there's a lot of language being played here. Misinformation. I mean, mis is almost like mistake. It's sort of a polite way of not saying you're wrong, but still saying you're wrong. And again, what Musk is saying, that in the swarm, there's a certain dynamic between differences that Musk feels will be productive.
The point I'm trying to make is that the BBC itself has, at times, published things that are false. Do you agree that that has occurred?
I'm quite sure the BBC have said things before that turn out to not be true.
Right.
In its, whatever it is, 100-year history, I'm quite sure.
Yes. Even if you aspire to be accurate, there are times when you will not be.
Right,
and I think in the grand scheme of things, the BBC does aspire to be accurate.
But you accept that.
And again, part of what's happening in the overall conversation is that accuracy itself is no longer a sufficient standard. Now, when you look at Megan Phelps-Roper's, is it a conversion story? I don't know that that's the right word, her transition, but that word is now freighted. Megan Phelps-Roper's change from her departure from Westboro Baptist. The accuracy was important, but again, accuracy sort of puts everything just on the prepositional. There's the perspectival, there's the participatory, and these are the procedural. That's in terms of behavior, but the perspectival is definitely coming into play here, and so part of what is impoverishing this conversation, I think, is part of what is fueling the conversation in this little corner, that you have to, just talking about accuracy is not going to get at it. And we've mentioned this many times, because it's not just the accuracy of the information, but the relevance, realization, and the selectivity of which information is actually important towards, I think, an overall well-being.
It has to be a line in terms of hate speech. I mean, you're not looking at total 100% unrestricted speech.
I generally am of the opinion that if the people of a given country are against a certain type of speech, they should talk to their elected representatives and pass a law to prevent it. So, for example, you cannot advocate murdering someone. That's illegal in the United States. Everywhere, really, I suspect. So there are limits to speech.
I mean, I guess taking your argument to a logical conclusion then, do you accept that there's more misinformation on the platform if it's not being policed in the same way?
And again, there's more misinformation. What does that mean? There's more error on the platform. Well, what does that mean? And I don't think any of this language is really getting at what either of these two want, which is, let's say, a better world. Okay, how do we understand a better world? What makes up a better world? How do you have a conversation that actually pursues a better world? So this information or misinformation doesn't really afford what both of them want here.
I actually think there's less these days because we've eliminated so many of the bots which were pushing scams and spam.
Okay, and this is what gets mentioned in the New York Post piece, that the quote that I just read. So what are bots and scammers? Scammers are basically crooks that are looking to take money from people who don't know any better. Bots are basically signal enhancers for certain ideas, and the idea is to influence the body politic, manipulate the swarm in such a way. But obviously there are many other elements to the swarm.
Previous management turned a blind eye to the bots because their bonuses were tied to user growth. And if you
So you had a procedural issue that was allowing for corruption within the swarm.
If your compensation is tied to user growth, well, you're not going to look too closely at some of the users. That's part of the problem. So I think we've got less misinformation because we don't have the bot problem that we used to do. And we also have given a lot of attention to community notes.
See, and his misinformation. Now, of course, with propositional knowledge, you want to be as accurate as possible, but that doesn't help you with the selection of which propositions and which little tidbits of knowledge are actually the relevant ones in terms of a much more perspectival pursuit of well-being.
Which corrects, with community itself, corrects misinformation. It's been very effective.
I would only just add that we have spoken to people who have been sacked that used to be in content moderation, and we've spoken to people.
Now this point, we've spoken to people who were sacked that used to be in content moderation. So he's trying to bring the ideas together, but that doesn't answer any of the question because, okay, do these content moderators actually, what is their end within the swarm?
Very recently who were involved in moderation, and they just say there's not enough people to police this stuff, particularly around hate speech.
Okay, and now we're getting into, okay, well, there's not enough people to police it. So in other words, do policies within the swarm, are they actually effective in terms of helping the swarm pursue its telos?
In the company.
What hate speech are you talking about? I mean, you use Twitter.
Right.
Do you see a rise?
Now, this is sort of the famous section where Elon sort of takes the guy apart.
Rise in hate speech?
I mean,
but just a personal anecdote. Like, what do you? I don't.
Personally, for you, I would see I get more of that kind of content. Yeah, personally. But I'm not going to talk to the rest of for the rest of Twitter.
So you see more hate speech personally?
I would say I would see more hateful content in that.
Content you don't like or hateful? What do you mean to describe a hateful thing?
Yeah, I mean, just content that will solicit a reaction, something that may include something that is slightly racist or slightly sexist.
It's amazing how he struggles to describe this hateful thing.
Those kinds of things.
So you think if something is slightly sexist, it should be banned?
No,
is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying anything. I'm
just curious. I'm trying to understand what you mean by hateful content. And I'm asking for specific examples. And you just said that if something is slightly sexist, that's hateful content. Does that mean that it should be banned?
Well, you've asked me whether my feed, whether it's got less or more. I'd say it's got slightly more.
That's why I'm asking for examples. Can you name one example?
I honestly don't use. Honestly, I
You
don't.
can't name a single example.
I'll tell you why, because I don't actually use that for you feed anymore, because I just don't particularly like it.
But you
and
said
actually, a lot of people are quite similar. I only look at
hang on a second.
my
You said you've seen more hateful content, but you can't name a single example, not even one.
I'm not sure I've used that feed for the last 3 or 4 weeks, and
Well, then how did you see the hateful content?
Because I've been using Twitter since you've taken it over for the last 6 months.
Okay, so then you must have at some point.
Now, there's a lot of back and forth here. Later in the interview, Musk is going to challenge him on whether or not reporters are actually the most competent people to, and I think if Musk were given better language, to afford the perspectival knowledge that is so essential in evaluating the kind of relevant, procedural, multi-formulated knowledge that actually pursues shalom, well-being, all of these things.
I've seen for you hateful content. I'm asking for one example.
Right.
And you can't give a single one.
And I'm saying...
I say, sir, that you don't know what you're talking about.
Really?
Yes, because you can't give me a single example of hateful content, not even one tweet. And yet you claimed that the hateful content was high.
Well...
That's false.
No, what I claimed...
You just lied.
What I claimed was there are many organizations that say that kind of information is on the rise. Now, whether it has on my feed or not... I mean, right, and
literally
you can look at something
one.
like the Strategic Dialogue Institute in the UK. They will say that. So
look, people will say all sorts of nonsense. I'm literally asking for a single example.
Now, what's interesting here is that the reporter now points to a different swarm. And that's what justifies. Oh, that's a now he's pointing not to a beast, but to a swarm. And saying, well, there, and it's like, well, wait a minute, you're looking at the swarm within which Twitter is a smaller swarm.
Well, you can't name one.
Right, and as I already said, I don't use that feed. But
then how would you know that?
I don't think this is getting anywhere.
You literally said you experienced more hateful content, and then couldn't name a single example.
Right, and as I said,
that's absurd.
I haven't actually looked at that feed.
Then how would you know there's hateful content?
Because I'm saying that's what I saw a few weeks ago. I can't give you an exact example. Let's move on. We only have a certain amount of time.
Now he's pointing to another authority, another Arenic authority, which is limitation of time and space and an implicit priority. Musk's not going to take it right away.
COVID misinformation. You changed the COVID misinformation
Has
rules.
BBC changed its COVID misinformation?
The BBC does not set the rules on Twitter, so I'm asking you.
No, I'm talking about the BBC's misinformation about COVID.
I'm literally asking you about, you changed the labels, the COVID misinformation labels. There used to be a policy, and then it disappeared. Why do that?
Well, COVID is no longer an issue. Does the BBC hold itself at all responsible for misinformation regarding masking and side effects of vaccinations, and not reporting on that at all? And what about the fact that the BBC...
And again, a beast is more liable to this kind of thing because supposedly it has a unified structure and it's a unified agent that is supposed to do within it the relevance realization and produce that as a product, whereas at least with the swarm, it's supposed to allow, in a sense, viewing agents to facilitate. So in that sense, again, Twitter is much more Arenic, whereas the beast, that is BBC, is much more agentic.
BBC was put under pressure by the British government to change its editorial policy.
And because it is now suddenly the beast is more subject to manipulation because it's univocal. It's more subject to manipulation from another beast, which would be, in this case, the British government.
Are you aware of that?
This is not an interview about the BBC.
Oh, you thought it wasn't?
Okay, now we're going to have some Arenic rules about the interview.
And I see now why you've done Twitter Spaces. I am not a representative of the BBC's editorial policy. I want to make that clear. Let's talk about something else. We want to talk about the BBC. All right, let's.
Okay, now we're going to go back to the regret question. This is the second time he asks it.
But I guess.
But look,
do you have any regrets buying Twitter?
I think it was something that needed to be done.
I mean, you said
it's
earlier
quite difficult, you know. I'd say that, like.
Now, again, you can see, just like with the article, he felt a sort of a moral, ethical reason to. The poor guy gets challenged for sacking these people for it not caring. But now on the other side, to what degree is the steward of the arena? This swarm arena within the larger arena. He sees the responsibility and the necessity for it.
The pain level of Twitter has been extremely high. This hasn't been some sort of party. So it's been really quite a stressful situation, for the last several months. Not an easy one. But apart from the pain, I mean, so it's been quite painful. But I think at the end of the day, it should have been done. I think. Were there many mistakes made along the way? Of course, but all's well that ends well, and so I feel like we're headed to a good place. We're roughly break even. I think we're trending towards being cash flow positive very soon, like literally in a matter of.
So again, back to the business side of this arena.
Of months. The advertisers are returning. I think the quality of recommended tweets has improved significantly, and we've taken a lot of feedback from.
Now that's interesting. The quality of recommended tweets has improved. Now, a number of years ago, Twitter made the controversial decision that when you open your timeline, you don't just sort of get the flow, although I believe, is there still that little button? That you can switch to that mode, but for the most part, we get these recommended tweets, which means that there's an algorithm in there that is supposed to be delivering quality, which is a very interesting concept and assertion. And now, again, he's made the point that the algorithm is now publicly, you can see the rules by which the quality is being discerned, and again, it's probably going to be a quality based on looking at the kinds of things you've looked at before. Well, what is the quality it's pursuing? It's probably pursuing attention, because just like all of these platforms, it wants to maximize the amount of time that you have, and that's either going to be with a sense of meaning and purpose and satisfaction, or some degree of addiction that you sort of mindlessly just stay on the thing because you stay on the thing.
People that have looked at the open source recommendation algorithm, and we've made a lot of improvements even since that was made open source, and we're going to keep doing that. So overall, I think the trend is very good. So,
I mean, it was actually something I was going to ask you. You mentioned the pain, but you actually tweeted, I think in February, you said the last 3 months have been extremely tough. I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone. Are you talking emotionally there? I mean,
yeah.
Can you explain?
What? This is a stupid question.
I wasn't stabbed or anything.
Right.
Like some people around here, which is dangerous.
Did you catch his answer? I wasn't stabbed or anything. No, it wasn't physical pain. Yes, it was emotional pain, and they do spend some time. He talks about the crime in San Francisco, which is something that's picked up on. I might jump into a Glenn Lowry video from here. We'll see.
First neck of the woods we're in.
It is, or it can be. But can you just talk me through the emotional strain of this?
Yeah, I mean, look,
Would you cry for me?
been under constant attack. I mean, it's not like I, have a stone cold heart or something like that. If you're under constant criticism and attack, and then that gets fed to you nonstop, including through Twitter, it's rough. Now, at the end of the day, I kind of think that, like, if you do lose your feedback loop.
So in a sense here, he's saying, I am willing to suffer for the swarm. And a number of places in this, he comments on the necessity for feedback and criticism for not only the health of the company, but for obviously signal discernment, and it's really, I'm pretty impressed by it.
That's actually not good. So I think it is actually important to get negative feedback. I don't turn replies off, and I actually I removed my entire block list.
Again, he doesn't turn replies off, which means, now there's so many to him he can't possibly see them, but he turned off his whole block list, so nobody's being blocked from it. That's a really that's an amazing thing.
So I don't block anyone either. So somebody can, so I get like a lot of negative feedback. But I think it's actually good to get negative feedback.
Right. When you talk about the emotional strain, you've gone back to feedback. Is that the thing that's been most difficult?
Would you please cry? I'd like you to cry for us.
Difficult to take the sort of negative feedback.
Yeah, I mean, if the media is writing nonstop stories about why you're a horrible person, I mean, it's hurtful. Obviously.
I'm interested. I've written down a lot of these questions, but I haven't written this one down. But it's interesting. It feels like you have quite a kind of interesting relationship with the media, because in some ways you're quite skeptical, quite critical, certainly of established media. But
so now the focus is going to go back to this question of the media. Back to the question of these beasts that are sort of lined up. They have editorial boards, they have perspectives, they have a degree of audience capture in that they have a symbiotic relationship with their subscribers or their... And so now suddenly we have this other much larger arena in which Elon Musk participates.
Also, you kind of get hurt by what the media writes, and you seem to. You do get your news still from the BBC, as you've already said.
I literally follow the BBC on Twitter.
So do you feel you have a kind of odd relationship with the media?
Yes.
Go on, explain.
No, it is somewhat of a love-hate relationship, although, I mean, it might be tilted a bit more towards the hate. But I think this is sort of part and parcel of having a free media situation, which is that I do take heart in that the media is actually able to trash me on a regular basis.
Now, he's sort of leveled up here because you sort of have the swarm of Twitter, but now we have this larger arena, and in a sense he's saying, hey, I'm the rules of the swarm, I'm trying to have them to one degree or another, even though they are manipulated and controlled by the algorithm and by the policy decisions and by the rules that I, in conjunction with whoever he's listening to with respect to Twitter, make up. There is a broader swarm that's going on, and even though that swarm costs me and is painful to me, I'm not going to cry for you right now, that's important too.
In the United States, the UK, and whatnot. Whereas, in a lot of other places, media cannot say mean things to powerful people.
Which is amazing, because if we pull up once again Senator Warren's, this deal is dangerous for our democracy. Billionaires like Elon Musk play in a different set of rules than everyone else. As if there's some uniform set of rules by which we all play, that if you don't have power and status and wealth, that living in America is a very different thing than if you have no status and no power and no wealth. But then many who live outside of America will say, yes, but your votes here in America count worldwide, and so on and so on and so on and so on.
Okay.
But I think it's better that we have a situation where the media can say mean things to powerful people.
In other words, he's okay with the swarm. Swarm's a good thing. Okay, now we're going to get the journalist quote.
If we're talking about the media, let's talk about verification labels. You obviously want to create another revenue stream that's subscription-based.
Now, what's amazing here is that, in a lot of ways, anybody who can afford $8 a month, which is not nothing, but it's not an enormous thing, unlike the old verification system, and now I think there should be some layer of verification that happens so that people are, in a sense, who they say they are, yet he's criticized for not being egalitarian enough, but the new system is designed to be more egalitarian in some way so that I can have a blue check just like the BBC.
Is verification the way to do that? Because we have a kind of a situation at the moment where the New York Times doesn't have a verified badge, whereas anyone else who can pay whatever few bucks a month can. Can that be right? Is that what you envisaged when you bought Twitter?
I must confess to some delight in removing the verified badge from the New York Times. That
An honest confession on his part.
That was great. Anyway, they're still alive and well, so they're doing fine.
But on a serious note,
yeah, New York Times reach is far beyond the reach of Paul Vanderklay.
It could flame disinformation again if you have verified accounts that are from anyone who can pay money. They go up to potentially the top of feeds. They get more action on Twitter, and traditional media that may not pay for verification doesn't. Do you see how that could potentially be a driver of misinformation?
Well, I mean, I think the media is a driver of misinformation much more than the media would like to admit that they are.
I mean, that's a different question.
Yeah, but
it's not a different question.
You are sort of saying like who knows best, the average citizen or someone who is a journalist.
And this I like what he said there, and this again is an evaluation between the swarm and these beasts, because and he just lays it out right now because he's dealing with reporters regularly.
And I think in a lot of cases, it is the average citizen that knows more than the journalist. In fact, I mean, very often when I see...
And again, knowledge here in terms of perspectival, procedural, this, and even propositional in many cases, because if you're local to something, you can see it. And this, in fact, has been one of the reasons that Twitter sort of took off, because you could have sort of normies and randos out there at least affording a little bit of knowledge and information and putting that into the swarm. And the idea was that if everyone realized it might be right, it might be wrong, but, you'd at least have a chance to know things that wouldn't necessarily go through gatekeepers. It's really at the heart of all the social media stuff.
An article about something that I know a lot about, and I read the article, and it's like, they get a lot wrong. And
if you've ever been covered by media, you see that immediately. I mean, some of the few instances that I've been covered by various media sources, they get enormous amounts of things wrong, and you can see that yourself if, even just practical things. And yeah, they might correct it, 3 or 4 days later at the back side of something, but by that point the impression is passed. And
sort of the best interpretation is someone who doesn't really understand what's going on in industry, has only a few facts to play with, has to come up with an article. Now, it's going to be, it's not going to hit the bullseye.
This is what I find regularly. So the reporter, you've got to write a story today about this, and so you do a little bit of research and you put in, boom, out you go. And you say, well, Vanderklay, you're doing the same thing. Yeah, but I don't have New York Times or BBC. It's like I get stuff wrong. Like I can't say 4chan without saying Fortran because I'm an old man that took Fortran when I was a kid in college, and every time I hear 4chan. But that's Paul Vanderklay. We know he messes up that stuff, or maybe we don't. But when I say Fortran instead of 4chan, most people listening are going to sort of mentally say, he means 4chan. That's just that crazy dude.
So then, like, generally, this is how I explain this to other people. If you read an article about something you know about, how accurate is that article? Now, imagine that is how essentially all articles are. They're an approximation of what's going on, but not an exact situation. So if somebody is actually, let's say, in the fray, or like an expert in the field, and was actually there, and writes about their experience of being actually there, I think that actually that's in a lot of cases going to be better than a journalist, because the journalist wasn't there.
And again, some of the 4 Ps of knowledge here would help him. And you find that on Twitter. You find people who are expert. That happened during COVID. Now again, you still have to do all of the sifting. Do I believe this expert or that expert? But you can find people who don't have a dog in the fight. And often, I mean, that's part of it, which is that people begin to understand that certain news media sources, usually if they're aligned with a particular political organization, will have a bias, and that bias is going to be reflected by the product that the beast is producing.
I think you said the legacy verified blue ticks are going to go next week. There have been a few deadlines on this.
420.
Yeah, I see the joke.
That number will never leave me.
I had to look up the joke.
I clearly.
It
cost you a lot of money.
Well, fortunately, it didn't in the trial.
Well, yeah, right, for the SEC, right?
Yes, we're going to ask for a refund.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Good luck. Let's move on from that. But blue ticks, in theory, all legacy blue ticks gone next week, and at that point you'll kind of work out whether this is going to sink or swim.
Yes.
What's your hunch? I mean, you've obviously.
I think it's going to swim.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll swim just fine.
Okay. What are you looking for in terms of a revenue stream on that? What are your goals?
Well, I don't know if it's like necessarily a giant revenue stream. Because even if you have sort of 1 million people that are subscribed for, let's say, $100 a year ish, that's $100 million. And that's a fairly small revenue stream relative to advertising. But what we're really trying to do here with verification is to massively raise the cost of disinformation and bots in general. So my prediction is that any social media company that does not insist on paid verification will simply be overwhelmed by advanced AI bots.
This is an interesting point that he makes.
I mean, ChatGPT is essentially a zillion instances of ChatGPT. How would
is
you
that
even
really
know?
what you want on the platform? Do you want big news?
And again, now, this reporter, is that really what did you? And what's funny is he's sitting there looking at his phone while Elon is talking, and you're thinking, he's not really listening. And when he asks the question, is that what you mean? Do I really want to not have millions of instances of bots on Twitter, spooning out whatever it is that those, I mean, this whole thing is set up, Elizabeth Warren says it at the beginning, this whole thing is set up as we have to resist Elon Musk because this is an elitist game because he's a billionaire. And now obviously you can debate different specific procedural innovations that he's putting in here, including increasing the cost of participation. But I think it's obvious that we don't want, for those values, I mean, he is trying in some ways to level the playing field a bit, understanding that there is no such thing as a level playing field, a perfectly level playing field.
Organizations being overwhelmed by bots so that they have to pay.
No, the
some
point is
money.
that you won't be.
If you pay. But a lot of organizations have already said they're not going to pay, like the New York Times.
Well, then,
The dude doesn't listen.
That's up to them if they, can make them pay. It's a small amount of money, so I don't know what their problem is. So
Paul Vanderklay can afford to pay $8 a month, but the BBC can't.
But we're going to treat everyone equally. So what we're not going to do is say that there's some anointed class of journalists who are the special ones who get to tell everyone what they should think. That it should be up to the people what they think. And even if an article is...
We're still replaying the Protestant Reformation.
Completely accurate and comprehensive and everything. There's still, in writing that article, the media is choosing the narrative. They're deciding what to write an article about. So I'm hopeful that this can be more a case of the public choosing the narrative, as opposed to the media choosing the narrative. But the media can choose the narrative, at least a combination of the media and the public choosing the narrative. And the public getting to weigh in on stories if they think that they should add something to it, or we got something wrong. And over time, I think if Twitter is the best source of truth, it will succeed. And if we are not the best source of truth, we will fail.
And now the use of source there is really important, because the idea is that there will be information out there, and the relevance realization done by individuals will carry the day. This was a little one, but it was interesting.
Someone comes in and offers you $44 billion for Twitter right now. Would you take it?
No.
Would you consider it?
No.
Why?
I take it back. It depends on who. I suppose if I was confident that they would pursue, they would rigorously pursue the truth, then I guess I would be glad to hand it off to someone else.
So in other words, it seems quite clear, at least Musk is saying, that he spent $50 billion of his own money in order to bless the public good. He's got a perspective, he's got a bias, of course, we all do, but...
I don't care about the money, really, but I do want to have some source of truth that I can count on. And I hope that's...
And here, basically, I want it this way, so the money, yeah, but I bought it for me. And it's like, wow. Well, I have my channel for a similar reason, and...
Our aspiration with Twitter is to have a source of truth that you can count on. It's also real time. It's an immediate source of truth that you can count on, and that gets more accurate with time as people comment on a particular thing.
Well, if you don't care about the money, you could just give it to someone that you think is a good person to run Twitter.
Who do you think that might be?
I'm not the boss of Twitter.
No, but choose.
It's terrible.
Well, you might still have an idea.
Who could run Twitter?
Yes.
Honestly, I have no idea who could run Twitter.
But yet I'm asking the questions.
Yeah, it's a hard job.
Okay, let's move on.
Okay, last clip. User. Elon as user in Twitter.
Pelosi tweet.
Leave it alone. Jesus.
But that is an example of a few, and there have been others. Do you feel like you're an impulsive person?
I mean, have I shot myself in the foot with tweets multiple times? Yes.
Do you feel like...
And again, I mean, people are going to have a lot of different opinions on Elon. I know Grim Grizz has his... I haven't checked recently if Elon's avatar is in the costume of a disciple of Baal, but he's being honest. He's coming to this interview, and I think he's being honest about who he is, like him or hate him. And this is a quality I think we saw in the Babylon Bee interview as well. And, maybe what these things show is that if the reporters aren't going to come to the interview with the same kind of honesty and humility, it's not going to go well.
You need bulletproof shoes at this point.
You've definitely done that. The issue is that you're now a Twitter owner. Do you feel like you should look at your tweets more? You have a higher responsibility when you tweet something out for it to be accurate?
I think I should not tweet after 3 a.m.
That's the rule.
Yeah, well, maybe 2 a.m.
That's the new rule.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, so there's a blanket ban.
I shouldn't.
Now, I want to mention Laura's comment about it was on the Catholic Conversation on Grail Country about Jordan Peterson on Twitter, and it was Daniel Jordan Wood's comment about, hey, standards for Christian behavior have long said that leaders should exemplify the wisdom in their public behavior. And I'm going to give Musk points here for learning.
I shouldn't.
What are your Twitter rules? I mean, I've had some people say never tweet when you've been drinking, or never tweet when angry. What are your Twitter rules?
Well, I think those are 2 good rules. Yeah, don't tweet if you're wasted, or really upset about something. Yeah, probably. I mean, a good friend of mine actually had a good suggestion, and it has helped, which is that if you're going to tweet something that maybe is controversial, save it as a draft and look at it the next day and see if you still want to tweet it. And that has been a good rule of thumb.
In other words, incorporate the future self in your present self when you're tweeting. Now, I want to end up with this video on black leadership, which I really love Glenn Loury and John McWhorter's conversations. I love these guys. And this was a great conversation. I had kind of a clickbaitable thumbnail and title, which I'm guilty of myself sometimes. But they're interviewing someone who's making charter schools in the Bronx and trying to lift up the black community. And he's a conservative, Lowry's a conservative, I'd say McWhorter's a moderate, let's say a liberal pragmatist, let's say. But I was really struck here by this 4-point plan and where the conversation went afterwards. And the 4-point plan doesn't really get too much at the whole conversation of the swarm and the beast, but it does get at being an agent in a chaotic arena and how to at least pursue ideals.
Let me try something on you, Ian. I noticed the subtitle of your book, 4-Point Plan for All Children. What I want to try on you is maybe we're barking up the wrong tree here and talking about black leadership. Maybe we should just be talking about leadership. Mm. And maybe looking for a black leader or a black voice is, not the most productive way of spending our time and not likely to be the most effective. Maybe we ought to go frontally at what some of the really deep issues are. I've said capitalism. I happen to be an economist. I happen to be a neoliberal economist, if you want to put a label on me, a person who believes in markets, enterprise. I think socialism is a bad idea. A bad idea. I think you, don't let me speak for you, believe in traditional family values. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had family and religion as the first 2 tenets of your 4-point plan.
Yes, it's called free. It's not called earth.
Well, let me simply observe that not everybody does. Okay, not everybody does. And I'm going to mention one other thing here, which is patriotism.
Yep.
Because
now it's part of what's interesting here is I've talked about both Glenn and John's religious postures before. Glenn, I'm still waiting for I don't think his memoir is out yet, but I'm really interested in his memoir because I very much want to read it. And I know I don't really chase after celebrity conversations or interviews, but I would do Glenn Loury because I think his story just fascinates me and really interests me. John McWhorter, likewise. John McWhorter is not religious, and he's going to say some, he's going to say some of these, religious is for the the common folks. It might not be for me, but for thee. Yeah, and also with respect to the family values, both Glenn and John have, in some public ways, struggled with maintaining marriages and struggled on the family front. And so I found this to be really interesting.
With respect to Nicole Hannah-Jones of the 1619 Project, with respect to Ta-Nehisi Coates of, the I ain't buying the American dream hype and whatnot like that. Belief in the ultimate goodness of this country and its institutions, notwithstanding the terrible difficulties that it has had to surmount. Not forgetting about slavery, but remembering about emancipation. Not forgetting about Jim Crow, but remembering about the revolution and civil rights. Knowing that the bedrock institutions on which Martin Luther King stood, he planted his flag on those institutions, are still with us and nurture the hopes of our grandchildren. I mean, in other words, don't make it about race at all.
Yeah, well, there's something to that. I mean, I've had the benefit over 20, 30 years of working at, running schools, White House, MTV, Teach for America, Gates Foundation. I've worked with every kind of kid. White kids, black kids, Hispanic kids, Asian kids, poor kids, rich kids, foster care kids, homeless kids. And I've seen kids in very challenging situations, domestic violence, poverty, family breakup, all of it. And yet, as they made their decisions into young adulthood, the kinds of decisions they made essentially recreated the same disadvantage that they grew up in. But I've also seen kids in those same situations make different kinds of decisions that actually allow them to break the cycle of disadvantage.
Now, what I really like this is there is very much an Agent Arenic quality to this. And he's noting that transformations can take place even in a chaotic, swarm-like arena where individuals can make choices, and then also the kinds of, how can we say it, the kinds of powers they need to pursue well-being within that arena.
And that's where free comes from, because these young people, as they made their decisions, as they, were in their early 20s, mid-20s, the first most fundamental thing they recognized, it wasn't about the family that they were from, it was about the family that they are on the pathway to form. And that's where we talk about the success sequence and young people who broke the cycle.
No, I really like that. I really like, because it's sort of, okay, they're striving for an ideal, and they have an ideal that's formed, and that ideal does have a structure. And so they live in the midst of all of the chaos, which has, obviously danger and potential. They live in the midst of it to now construct something that they are going to pursue.
Of disadvantage, in my observation, typically were on a pathway of finishing their education, work, and if they had kids, they were going to get married first. That was the first big anchor. That's my first big observation. The second big observation, and the reason why this is so important, because to your point, Glenn, this isn't about race. But my second big observation was that young people who were on the cycle of breaking the cycle of disadvantage usually had some kind of personal faith commitment. They usually had coming from some kind of religious affiliation. They had
Now, it's interesting to see John McWhorter shake his head or nod his head at this and say, yeah, that's right.
Moral code. Didn't matter if it was Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, whatever.
Now, I'm going to say, again, back to my point with respect to sort of this omni-religion point, that the vast majority of religious people, with the religions that they have practicing in America, religions that are recognized in America, religions that are valued in America, my assertion is that in many ways there's been a deep impact of Christianity and its formations of these religions in America, that they all sort of have they have some of this quality. I'm not saying that those religions outside of America don't have those qualities, but I think actually the mixture of them in this country, given the history of this country, has formed them so that Islam, that Judaism, that various forms of Christianity, that various forms of Buddhism in America absorb things from the American religious context that's deeply shaped by Christianity into a particular religious expression and mode.
But they were part of a community of people that lived by a moral code. And that was kind of an anchor of their decision making. So that was my second big observation. So it was F, then R. The third observation of young people who broke the cycle of disadvantage was that they typically benefited from some kind of educational freedom or school choice. Their parents, by hook or by crook, were going to get them into a good charter school. They're going to move to neighborhood, rent an apartment.
So this is, in a sense, touching on the swarm. There were various things available. It wasn't limitless opportunity, but there were various things available, and they could act as an agent within the arena to pursue at least what they hoped would be a better choice.
So they could go to the local public school, but somehow that third element of education was central to young people who've broken, in my observation. And with those first three of family, religion, education, that usually added up to the fourth, which was this idea that they developed an entrepreneurial mindset, that they were a problem solver in their own lives.
Now this entrepreneurial mindset, I think, again, is sort of an agent within the swarm that can say, I know where I'm going, and I'm going to go start picking this, and then this, and then this. I'm going to feed off the chaos and construct something that pursues my goal.
That's where free comes from. It's not race-based. It's institution-based. This is how we develop young people of all races. That's why I named the book as I did. It's a 4-point plan for everybody. I just use Black because that seems to be our entry point for so many of these issues. But the concepts are universal. That if you want young people to really flourish, we have to encourage young people to understand the power of family, not the family that you're from, the family that you're going to form. The importance of a personal faith commitment, usually some kind of religious affiliation, education through some kind of freedom, and then this idea of entrepreneurship, problem solver in your own life. So I'm with you, Glenn. I use race because I actually do believe, and this is one thing I actually do agree with Nikole Hannah-Jones on, the African-American story can be one that is inspiration for everyone in our country of triumph over adversity. It's just that I think we've forgotten the institutions that actually allowed Black people to be successful even under the most terrible conditions.
I think one thing that we definitely want to understand at this point in time also, and Ian, I agree with, even though I'm not a religious person, I agree with everything you're saying, including that religion plays such a big part in people helping themselves and helping other people. And I think that's a great thing.
You can just feel the page turn from New Atheism, can't you?
We have to remember that the channel that we get our message out through, we have to get rid of a habit that I'm certainly very stuck in, but it's not going to be books. And it's not because of anything about Black people and reading. It's about humanity and reading, especially in our era where there is so much to distract. I think the idea that the main way to get it across, and Ian, I'm really glad you wrote a book, but the main way that you get it across, I don't think is that medium anymore. And part of it is because in the publishing industry, and I shouldn't bite the hand that feeds me because here I am, I've gotten lucky. But, woke racism, nobody wanted it. If you're looking at the publishing industry and its biases, they want the three named people's books.
Okay, so now we have this beast. So now, in a sense, we're talking about the beasts again. And in that sense, markets and swarms have a degree to them of value that allows things to arise.
I'm sure that Nikole Hannah-Jones is writing a memoir and it's going to go running out of the stores. Woke racism, nobody wanted it until somebody did. And that somebody is very happy because the book has sold very well. And I'll bet a lot of the people.
Now for the people who are listening and not watching, because they put up the cover that had John McWhorter's book, this is a book written by John McWhorter.
Who turned it down and now reconsidering how they felt. But it's not going to change. They
Right.
feel that they're supposed to be purveying this sort of three-name person message. And also just people have less time to read these days. I think the main thing is the podcast. I think the way you get to people is through their ears and doing, and I'm not trying to give a backhanded compliment to this podcast, but if we're going to make a real movement, we have to be represented through something that people can get from their phones and put in their ears. And Coleman and the...
Now what's really interesting too is that even though Google and Spotify and Apple are trying to sort of contain the podcasts, RSS feed podcasts have been the most open, the most swarm-like element of the internet for a while now. You can go out and buy some space on the internet with an internet, with a host, with a web host, and start your own blog, but that's almost 20 years behind us now. And with YouTube, you have YouTube and the algorithms, and Twitter's and the algorithms. So in many ways, podcast is much more of the openness. And what's amazing is that with all of the hand-wringing that we've had about Twitter, in some ways, without it being containerized, some of these elements like podcast actually do better because they are unrestricted. Now, the openness is also difficult in many ways if you want to get your podcast out there. And again, I stumbled into this. I did not think any of this through, but very quickly I noticed that doing things on YouTube with the help of the algorithm, with the help of that algorithm within the swarm that is YouTube, can actually get you more of an audience. But podcasts are enormously unrestricted. I remember when I was setting up years ago, when I set up the first podcast of just audio recordings of church services, it's an RSS, real simple syndication. Hey, see, I'm an old guy. I've been around the internet a little while. I might not know. I've never been on 4chan instead of Fortran, but I did write Fortran in college, and COBOL, although I can't remember any of it, and BASIC. But really simple syndication out there in the open and free internet. There's something to that. Chaos.
Raps, that's a great idea, but it's a very telegraphic form. You can't get across extended ideas in a song. And so I hope he keeps doing that. But I think that in terms of ideas that are of extended form, and I'm sure he knows this, it's podcasts today. I just want to get out there that we should think of that.
And I'll just add quickly, in addition to podcasts, convenings, important convenings. We're all inspired by a man named Thomas Sowell, who back in 1980 was very frustrated. In 1980, was frustrated at the decline or actual reversal of progress within the Black community, and he thought associated with many liberal policies. This was back in 1980. So he held a conference called the Black Alternatives, more known as the Fairmont Conference in San Francisco, where he brought together these incredible people of all races who just had different ideas of social progress. Didn't have all the answers, but this idea of empowering alternatives to the general.
So again, in having, you can go to the quest for a spiritual home, but having an in-person thing where people can get together, and it's in a sense, more chaotic, sort of like a Twitter, sort of like a swarm, where you can deal with those ideas.
Narrative. I had the honor of partnering with Glenn, Jason Riley, and Shelby Steele last year to hold a 40-plus year anniversary of that conference in Old Parkland, Texas. And it was amazing because we brought together some brilliant people who had just differing views on how we can be successful.
Let me tell the audience, Ian, excuse me, that if they search Old Parkland on YouTube, they'll find a wealth of video capturing the essence of that conference. It's wonderful. So if you're interested, go look for it.
Yes, if you want to have your mind blown about empowering ideas for how people of all races can succeed, just spend a few hours watching those discussions. We're going to be holding another one in likely May of 2024. Similarly, to bring together people who think differently than what the general narrative. So in addition to podcasts, John, also let's bring people together in a sense of open idea and inquiry of how we know our community can make progress.
Okay, you guys, we're getting to the end of the hour, and I have a paradox to pose to you.
Now, I really like what Glenn does here, but I'd have to really stretch to incorporate it into the fuller theme of this podcast. He basically says, he basically contrasts Clarence Thomas and Barack Obama, and maybe I'll just play it. Why not? Because actually, I think the end of it, when what Glenn basically comes down to is the valence. Now, it's the valence that he disagrees with. And I think John McWhorter, I'm not going to play it. John McWhorter makes some excellent points about this is part of the reason why Clarence Thomas has not, in a sense, been able to. I'll play it. Why not?
And I'd like to hear your reaction to it. I'm being devilish here, so brace yourself. The two greatest Black political figures of the last century are Barack Hussein Obama and Clarence Thomas. Obama was twice elected president of this great country with a majority of votes cast for him. Thomas is the senior member of the United States Supreme Court who's been there for decades, served long, and had an enormous impact on American law. I could go into their biographies, but I don't think I need to say much more than that. Obama's mother is white, his father an African immigrant, and he grew up in Hawaii and spent some time in Indonesia and made his way to the south side of Chicago, where I'm from eventually, but believe me, it took a long time for him to get there. Thomas is a son of the Geechee-speaking Sea Islands of Georgia, of African-American heritage, as poor as you could possibly want to get, and as alienated from the mainstream of American society as anyone could be, and has made his way to the top of government. However, whereas Obama is lionized by every Black leader that you could find who's willing to speak in public about this subject as a great historic figure. And Thomas is vilified as despicable and beyond worthy of even being discussed by many of those very same people. How do you account for this paradox?
There was a time when Barack Obama, prior to him running, if you listen to his speeches, he talked about the importance of marriage and fatherhood and responsibility and personal accountability. And I think for a time, those two almost converge. I mean, he was still socialist anyway, but there was.
Oh, okay. Let me get my controls here. I actually want to go back and touch on something that Ian Rao said earlier with respect to this, because I've made this point before. Let's see, I'm at 53, 55.
With you, John, is because for a lot of these folks, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Ta-Nehisi Coates, in their own personal lives, what are they doing? They're leveraging the institutions of our country to lead quite prosperous lives. They're getting married. They're having children within marriage. They're, gainfully employed. They're leveraging capitalism. So they are quite cognizant of the power of the institutions that folks like us say are so critical for the uplift of our people. And yet they constantly bash these institutions in their public lives. So it is very hard to reconcile that there isn't some deliberate attempt to kind of hide the power of what they're doing in their own lives and saying, no, but that's not good enough for the rest of us.
They think of themselves as lucky. They think of themselves as lucky exceptions, but they figure that it would be wrong to expect the masses of Black people to do what they did or to have access to the resources that they maybe think of themselves as having accidentally had. That's my sense.
Why are you being so generous to them?
This is genuinely the way I see it. We're going to have to get specific. Every day on Twitter, daily, there is somebody who is connected with my feed who's calling Ibram Kendi a huckster, that he's doing all this stuff just to make money. He's this trickster. I don't like the man. He doesn't like me, and as a result, I find him a very distasteful human being. However, I don't think that he's a huckster. I think he's just limited. He's not doing it because he's trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes. It's that he really believes all of these things that he's saying. He thinks he's a lucky guy, but that most people are barred by this abstract racism that the country has been stamped with from the beginning. I don't see him as evil or sly in that way. It isn't a necessary analysis. It's just that there's only so much he can see, and to a man with a hammer, everything can become a nail. That's all.
So why doesn't he agree to debate you in public, to debate his ideas?
Okay, you got to go back to the end.
And responsibility and personal accountability, and I think for a time, those two.
And again, both Lowry and McWhorter have struggled with these things.
Who almost converge. I mean, he was still socialist anyway, but there was a point at which they were not so far from each other. And then he became president, and then he succumbed, in my view, to what is more politically expedient. And certainly in his post-presidency, he has not done the things that really could drive our country forward. What explains it? Clarence Thomas has the courage.
Okay, now, there's something about living within the beast that in that structure, you're going to conform to that structure, and it can be good or it can be bad. If you have a hierarchy, and if you have a structure, and you have a telos, everything within is going to conform to it. And so, I mean, in some ways, we're sort of back to chaos and order, but that's a part of this, that what you are living within will construct you. And the degree of the thickness of the institution, of the arena, for better or worse, it will mold you in that shape. And so again, all the way back to Jonathan Haidt, the elephant in the path. If you want to change the elephant, it's not the rider so much that changes the elephant, it's the path the elephant is on.
Courage to stand up for the convictions, the principles of this country. And unfortunately, those are under attack. They're under assault. There's no other way to put it. However, he's generally right. And he's generally right about the things that advance the interests of Black people and people of all races in our country. And so I think we're at this time of national reckoning. It's a time for choosing. Not to steal Ronald Reagan's line, but it's a time for choosing. Are we going to choose equality of opportunity as individuals? That's equality. Or are we going to choose equity, the absence of disparities of outcomes between racial groups? They're two very different strategies, in many ways, I believe, embodied by Clarence Thomas and the Barack Obama of present day. We got to choose. And I'm putting my thumb on the lever of equality of opportunity for individuals. We got to go down fighting for that, because we know at the end of the day, that's what's best for society at large, and certainly for Black people specifically.
Thomas has an optics problem. And I truly hate to say that it is partly his doing. There are people who would despise him regardless. But I think that he could push the needle if there were two things he had done, or maybe would do now. His silence on the court means that you don't get a piece of him. You don't get a sense of what is behind his views. You just...
Okay, so this is really interesting because he's not participating in the swarm.
Get the views on the record, which often can look rather heartless, especially if you're not familiar with looking at race issues from many angles. And let's face it, most people aren't. Why would they be? Most of us aren't familiar with most things. But if you're used to looking at race in one way, then when you hear some of the decisions that he makes, it looks like you might think he's a terrible person when he isn't. But you don't get in the news a regular, series of quotations of things that he's asked and things that he's said, where you would get an idea at least of where he was coming from, and you might be able to see that he's not crazy. He's not malevolent. He just sees things differently. That's partly his doing. And I don't believe that the reason he doesn't talk is because he's insecure about his Gullah Creole background. I think it's any number of other things, but that silence has been a problem. And then another thing I say, and it's a genuine question, I don't know what it is, when he put out the autobiography some years ago, it was rather opaque, and not because of things that he couldn't have said, but for example, when he was describing how he came to be against affirmative action. Now that must be a very interesting story. He dispatched of it all in a few pages and didn't really explain what his beef was when he was a young man, except for a few quick lines. Now, I don't know why. Maybe he's a rather private person, but it means that you could read that book and what you come away with is, learning that, he had a difficult childhood and he was very poor. But once he's at Yale, you lose him. He's not willing to explain what his thought process was. And next thing you know, he's married to Ginny Thomas and smoking cigars. And it's just.
And so there's a transparency issue here of playing in this arena, of participating, of being known. If you're going to participate in the swarm, you're going to have to at least go out there and expose yourself to it and be exposed by it at an appropriate level.
It's him in a way. He needs better PR. And I genuinely don't know why he has been that way. I don't know. But I think some of it is that he's a cipher unless you know him personally, as opposed to Barack Obama, where there was just better PR. That's what I think.
Okay, thanks. I put that challenge to you both. I think I should probably respond to it myself. And my thought is Barack Obama was and is a pragmatic progressive. He was the guy that was going to complete the FDR LBJ program with universal health care. He's a man of the left, a community organizer, somebody who's fighting for progress as understood by the left of the political spectrum, moderate left, pragmatic left.
So there's always another arena. There's another container.
Clarence Thomas is a principled conservative. He's not a legislator. He's not an executive. He's a judicial guy. But within that realm, he adheres to a philosophical doctrine that one identifies with what Republican presidents are looking for when they appoint people to the bench. And from my point of view, the issue here is whether or not we African Americans are married to the left. Whether or not in the essence of our striving, we have to plant our flag in a politically ideological left of center position. I think the answer to that must be no. It must be no for patriotism. This is a great country. Let us not.
I love listening to Glenn Loury speak. I might not. Again, I cannot say I might not agree with him on everything without listening to Nate and Laura talk about that phrase, because there are few people on the internet that I see speak with such passion and conviction. I love listening to Glenn Loury talk.
Not forget all the blessings that flow from the greatness of this republic. It matters in terms of traditional family values. There is no substitute for a mother and father raising their children.
And again, this is something that Glenn and John have struggled with, but yet they talk about it, and I think they talk about it with conviction, and they talk about it with integrity, and they've been very open in the ways that they have not achieved the goal.
It matters in terms of opportunity. You've got to make your wealth. It's not falling from the sky, and nobody's going to give it to you.
Unless you live in San Francisco.
They in the earlier parts of the video, they talked about. We can play it right at the beginning.
Later, what have we gotten? We should talk about that.
Ian Rose, also a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he runs a shop that's interested in see. And all their pathway.
And John, always an honor to be with you and that you are right.
We're here to talk about the topic du jour. Anniversary is American history, a lifetime of the country like that. Not to put words in his mouth, but you're up to that kind of activity.
I shouldn't edit while I've got the thing recording, but I'll leave it there. And yeah, just again, continued thinking about the swarms, about the containers, about the beasts, about the agents within chaotic arenas having to construct something towards an ideal, towards a telos. As best they can, we certainly do so, all of us, imperfectly and with confusion sometimes, but the reason for allowing enough chaos in the midst so that agents can see, this is where the title's going to come at the end of the video. That's the way it's going to come. After I turn it off, I'm going to sit here quietly and I'm going to think about it, and then there will be a title. So thanks for watching, and leave a comment.